1938, the United States had more than 400,000 people locked inside psychiatric institutions. 400,000 people. That number is not a rounding error. It is not a historian's approximation. It was the documented census of American state hospitals, buildings that were, in most cases, already operating beyond their physical limits. Wards designed for 80 patients held 120. Beds lined corridors that were never intended to be sleeping quarters. The floors smelled of disinfectant and something underneath the disinfectant that disinfectant could never quite reach. These places had many names: state hospitals, asylums, sanitariums. The polite language shifted with the decades, but the architecture did not change much. Iron gates, thick walls, wards that locked from the outside.
And inside those wards, human beings who had been delivered there by their families, by courts, by physicians, or by the simple fact that they had become inconvenient to the world outside. The popular name for the worst of them was snake pit. Not because snakes were present, though conditions approached something near to that. The term came from an older tradition. The belief that throwing a mentally ill person into a pit of snakes would shock them back to sanity through pure terror. By the 20th century, the snakes were metaphorical. The shock was not. Consider what daily life inside one of these institutions looked like. You woke in a ward with dozens of other people.
The noise was constant, not the noise of conversation, but of distress, repetition, the particular sounds of minds that had lost access to silence. Attendants carried keys. Restraint was standard practice, not exceptional measure. A patient who became agitated could be placed in a straitjacket for hours. A patient who remained agitated could be placed in a cold tub. Hydrotherapy, the records called it, where the temperature of the water held near freezing was understood to quiet the body by exhausting it. There were also isolation rooms, small, windowless, or nearly so. A patient placed in isolation had no reliable way to know how much time had passed. Hours and days blurred together in the particular darkness of institutional walls. None of this was secret.
Physicians, administrators, and the occasional journalist had been writing about these conditions for decades. The snake pit was a known thing. It was simply accepted, in the way that a great many terrible things are accepted as a cost of maintaining order. The people inside the asylums were, in the eyes of most administrators and most of the public, beyond the reach of care. They were being housed. That was considered sufficient. But housed for what purpose and toward what end? This is where the diagnostic system of the era must be understood, or rather, must be understood as something that barely deserved to be called a system at all. In the 1930s and 40s, psychiatric diagnosis was a project of remarkable imprecision.
A patient admitted with what we would today recognize as severe depression might receive the same institutional placement as a patient experiencing full psychotic episodes. Someone with what we would now call an anxiety disorder might share a ward with someone in the acute phase of schizophrenia. Epilepsy, a neurological condition, was frequently managed inside psychiatric facilities. And then there were the categories that had no clinical basis at all: moral insanity, feeble-mindedness, constitutional psychopathic inferiority. was used to classify people whose primary offense was behavioral nonconformity, women who refused to follow domestic expectations, men who expressed attraction to other men, individuals whose cultural practices differed from the dominant norm. The asylum was not only a medical institution.
It was also, and perhaps primarily, an instrument of social management. Here is the truth that runs beneath all of this. When a society does not understand something, it tends first to contain it. The mind was not understood. Mental illness was not understood. And so the preferred solution was walls, iron gates, locks that operated from the outside. The asylum was not a treatment. It was a disappearance. An organized, institutionally sanctioned disappearance of people who had become, in some way, too difficult to see. And it is worth understanding exactly who was disappearing. The 40% who arrived at state hospitals with what we would now recognize as genuine psychotic illness.
But also the young women who had attempted suicide after being assaulted, and whose families chose hospitalization over scandal. The elderly men whose families could no longer afford their care and whose eccentricity had escalated in the paperwork of admission into dementia. The immigrants whose behavior, filtered through language and cultural barriers, appeared to physicians as disorganized and therefore pathological. The children, and there were children, whose poverty and neglect produced behaviors that looked, to the clinical eye of the era, like mental deficiency. The asylum received all of them indiscriminately. The diagnostic categories were porous enough that almost anyone could pass through them, in the right circumstances.
And once inside, the paperwork of discharge was nearly as difficult to navigate as the circumstances that had produced the admission. You came in with a diagnosis. The diagnosis did not expire. And without a family willing to receive you back, without economic resources that would allow independent living, without a legal framework that gave you rights inside an institution, you stayed. And yet the physicians who worked in those institutions were not, by and large, monsters. Many of them were genuinely committed to the welfare of their patients. The problem was not malice. The problem was helplessness. They had no effective tools. Decades of work had produced nothing that reliably alleviated the suffering of the people in their care. Talk therapy was emerging, but slow.
Medications as we understand them did not yet exist. The options available were restraint, sedation with alcohol or barbiturates, cold water, rest, and time inside the asylum had a way of simply accumulating without healing anything. Into this helplessness, this enormous, institutional, professionally legitimate helplessness, came the idea of surgery. Surgery was triumphant in the 1930s. Antibiotics had changed infection. Anesthesia had made the operating table survivable. The centuries' relationship to the human body had been reorganized around the principle that opening it up and cutting things out could, under the right circumstances, produce cure. It was not an unreasonable inference from that foundation that perhaps there was something inside the skull that could be cut. Perhaps the brain, like the appendix or the gallbladder, contained regions whose removal might free the rest of the organism from dysfunction. It was a seductive idea, and it was wrong in ways that would not be fully understood for another 2 decades. But in 1935, none of that was yet known. What was known was that the asylums were full. The patients were suffering. The physicians were desperate.
His full name was Antonio Caetano de Abreu Frere Egas Moniz. He was born in 1874 in Avanca, a small town in northern Portugal. By 1935, he was 61 years old, internationally recognized in neurology, and deeply frustrated. He had made his name developing cerebral angiography, a technique for injecting contrast dye into the blood vessels of the brain and capturing them on X-ray, producing the first detailed maps of the brain's vascular structure. It was a genuine, significant, lasting contribution to medicine. It should perhaps have been enough. It was not enough for Moniz. He wanted to solve the problem that no one had solved. The problem of psychiatric illness. The problem of the snake pit.
He believed, with what his contemporaries described as absolute conviction, that the answer was neurological, not psychological, not social, not moral. Neurological. The brain was a physical organ. Psychiatric illness was a physical malfunction, and physical malfunctions could be corrected physically. In the summer of 1935, Moniz attended the Second International Congress of Neurology in London. There, a Yale researcher named Carlisle Jacobson presented the results of an experiment he had been conducting with chimpanzees. Jacobson had been working with 2 chimpanzees named Becky and Lucy. Both animals had been trained to perform memory tasks, tasks that required them to observe a food reward, wait for a brief delay, and then select the correct location to receive the reward.
Both animals experienced significant frustration when they made errors. Becky, in particular, exhibited what Jacobson described as frustration neurosis. When she failed a task, she would throw tantrums, refuse to participate, and demonstrate prolonged agitation. Jacobson then removed the frontal lobes of both animals. The surgery destroyed the portions of the prefrontal cortex that were understood, even then, to be central to higher-order reasoning, planning, and emotional regulation. After the surgery, both chimpanzees lost their ability to perform the memory tasks, but they also lost something else. They lost their agitation. Becky, the animal who had previously thrown tantrums, now performed the tasks with complete equanimity. She no longer exhibited frustration when she failed. She no longer seemed to understand, in any meaningful sense, that she had failed.
She simply moved through the task with the untroubled ease of a creature whose relationship to failure had been surgically severed. Jacobson found this result interesting. He presented it as data. He was not, by most accounts, advocating for the procedure's application to human beings. Egas Moniz found it transformative. He stood up in the conference room. Accounts of this moment vary, but several witnesses later confirmed that Moniz spoke from the floor during the discussion period. And he asked Jacobson directly, could this not be done in humans? Could the destruction of frontal lobe tissue not relieve the suffering of psychiatric patients? Jacobson was reportedly uncomfortable with the question.
The leap from a laboratory chimpanzee that could no longer be frustrated by a food reward task to a suffering human being in an asylum ward was not a leap that he had considered carefully. He did not endorse the idea. He noted the significant differences between chimpanzee and human cognition. He expressed concern. Moniz was not deterred. He returned to Lisbon with a theory. The theory was this: psychiatric illness, particularly what he called fixed ideas, the intrusive, circular, repetitive thought patterns, characteristic of severe anxiety and obsessive states, was the result of abnormal, fixed connections between the prefrontal cortex and the thalamus. These connections had become pathologically rigid.
They were, in his framework, neurological ruts, grooves worn so deep by repetitive thought that the mind could no longer move out of them. And if those connections could be severed, the grooves would collapse. The thought patterns would dissolve. It was a theory constructed almost entirely from inference. There was no direct evidence for it. The neuroanatomy of psychiatric illness was, in 1935, essentially unknown. Moniz was proposing to cut something he could not see, to treat something he did not understand, based on an extrapolation from two chimpanzees that had been rendered docile by the destruction of their frontal lobes. He moved forward anyway. The first procedure was performed on the 12th of November, 1935.
The patient was a woman. Her identity has been partially obscured in the historical record, consistent with the era's practice of protecting psychiatric patients from public exposure, or perhaps simply consistent with its practice of not considering them fully worth naming. She was 63 years old, diagnosed with anxiety and depression, and had been hospitalized for some time. She could not consent in any way that would satisfy modern ethical standards. She was, in the parlance of the time, a suitable candidate. Moniz did not perform the surgery himself. His hands, damaged by gout, made delicate surgical work difficult. The operating surgeon was Almeida Lima, a neurosurgeon who had worked with Moniz and who would perform this procedure and many that followed. Moniz directed from outside the operating room.
The technique involved drilling into the skull and injecting alcohol into the white matter of the frontal lobes. The idea being that the alcohol would destroy the nerve fibers running through that region, severing the connections that Moniz believed were causing the illness. Later procedures used a device Moniz called a leucotome, a thin instrument with a retractable wire loop that could be inserted into the brain and rotated to core out small cylinders of white matter. He operated on 20 patients between November of 1935 and early 1936. Then he published. His 1936 report claimed that 7 of the 20 patients had been cured, 7 had improved, and 6 had shown no change. No patient, he asserted, had been made worse.
Read that claim carefully. 7 cured, 7 improved, 6 unchanged, 0 worse. There was no control group. There were no blind assessors. The people evaluating the outcomes were the same team that had performed the surgery. There were no standardized outcome measures. There was no long-term follow-up. There was no systematic definition of what cured or improved meant in operational terms that could be reproduced by another researcher. What there was instead was Moniz's judgment. And Moniz judged his procedure a success. He also, notably, published the results within months of performing the first procedure. The speed was striking. 1935 to 1936.
In modern medical research, the processes of peer review, replication, and long-term follow-up can take years, sometimes decades, before a procedure is considered ready for clinical adoption. Moniz was done in a season. The medical community received his report with a mixture of skepticism and cautious interest. A few voices raised concerns about the absence of rigorous controls. But the concerns did not gain significant traction. Because Moniz was not an unknown, He was not a fringe figure. He was an internationally recognized neurologist, a pioneer of cerebral angiography, a man with enormous scientific credibility. When he said his procedure worked, his credibility went with the claim. And there was something else at work. Something harder to name, but important to understand. The asylums were full.
The patients were suffering. Physicians were desperate for anything that might constitute a solution. Into that desperation, Moniz arrived with a scalpel and a report that said 7 out of 20 were cured. Desperate people do not always demand rigorous methodology. In 1949, the Nobel Committee awarded Egas Moniz the Nobel Prize in Physiology, or Medicine. He shared the prize with Walter Rudolf Hess, a Swiss physiologist who had mapped the functions of the diencephalon, the inner structures of the brain. Hess's work was meticulous, detailed, and built on decades of careful observation. Moniz's was built on 20 patients and a theory derived from 2 chimpanzees. The Nobel Prize stood. It stands today.
In 1944, one of his former patients shot him. 4 bullets entered his body. He survived, but the spinal damage left him partially paralyzed. His legs no longer carried him reliably through the world. He spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair or moving with significant difficulty. He did not stop advocating for the lobotomy. Not once. Not in any public statement that has survived, not in any letter or publication. The man who had been shot by a patient who had presumably undergone his procedure, or who had some other deep grievance rooted in what that procedure had done, continued to the end of his life to insist that the surgery was beneficial, that it relieved suffering. That it was a legitimate and important medical intervention. There is something in that refusal that resists simple explanation. It is not quite the behavior of a fraud who knows his work is false. It is something closer to the behavior of a person whose belief has become impervious to evidence, including evidence written on his own body.
Walter Jackson Freeman II was not a surgeon. This detail matters enormously, and it is worth pausing to let it register. He was a neurologist, a physician trained in the diagnosis of neurological conditions, in the clinical examination of the nervous system, in the interpretation of symptoms, and the management of neurological disease. He was not trained to operate. He did not hold surgical privileges at American hospitals. He had not completed a surgical residency. His hands had never been guided through the systematic discipline that surgery requires. He became, nonetheless, the person most responsible for introducing brain surgery to American psychiatry. Freeman was born in 1895 in Philadelphia, the grandson of the prominent neurosurgeon William Williams Keene. Medicine was embedded in his family identity.
He trained at Yale and the University of Pennsylvania and came of age professionally in an era when neurology was establishing itself as a serious scientific discipline. By the early 1930s, he was the head of neurology at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and he was already known as someone with a particular gift for self-promotion and an extraordinary appetite for attention. He read Moniz's 1936 report with immediate excitement. Within the year, he had made contact with a colleague, a neurosurgeon at George Washington University named James Watts, and proposed that they attempt to replicate Moniz's procedure in the United States. Watts would provide the surgical hands. Freeman would provide the conceptual framework and the clinical judgment.
Together, on the 14th of September 1936, they performed the first prefrontal leucotomy in the United States. The patient was a 63-year-old woman from Kansas named Alice Hammett, who had been suffering from severe anxiety and insomnia and depression. Hammett survived the procedure. In the immediate aftermath, Freeman and Watts reported that she was calmer, less anxious, and easier to manage. What happened to her in the months and years that followed is more complicated. Her anxiety returned, and she required additional interventions, and her cognitive and emotional functioning never fully stabilized. But the initial report emphasized improvement. Freeman was energized. He had found his project.
Over the following years, he and Watts refined their technique. Moving away from the alcohol injection method Moniz had originally used toward the leucotome approach, drilling holes in the skull and coring out tissue from the prefrontal white matter. They developed what they called the Freeman-Watts standard technique, documented their cases with the detail that Freeman, at least in these early years, brought to his work, and began publishing their results. Their 1942 book, Psychosurgery, Intelligence, Emotion, and Social Behavior Following Prefrontal Lobotomy for Mental Disorders, brought the procedure to wide professional attention. And then, Freeman began to travel. This is the element of his story that is hardest to explain without context. He was not required to travel.
He was not a consultant who had been hired by other institutions. He traveled because he wanted to. He drove to psychiatric hospitals across the eastern United States, demonstrated the procedure, trained physicians who were willing to learn it, and advocated for its adoption. He gave lectures. He wrote articles. He maintained an enormous correspondence. He positioned himself. And this is not an uncharitable reading. It is simply accurate. As the apostle of a new psychiatric treatment that he was convinced would transform American medicine. He was not wrong that it would transform American medicine. He was wrong about what kind of transformation it would be.
The patients who received lobotomies in the early American phase of the procedure, the late 1930s and early 1940s, were, for the most part, people who had spent years in state psychiatric hospitals, chronic schizophrenia, severe treatment-resistant depression, in some cases, severe anxiety disorders. These were people for whom the other available options, and the options were few, had not produced meaningful improvement. In that context, the offer of a surgical intervention that might reduce their agitation, reduce their suffering, allow them to function at some minimal level outside the institution. That offer had a certain logic. There were also, in these years, patients who did not fit that description. Patients who had been hospitalized for relatively minor behavioral irregularities. Patients whose families had decided they were too difficult to manage at home. Patients who were, in the clinical parlance of the time, poorly adapted, a category flexible enough to include almost anyone whose behavior made the people around them uncomfortable. Freeman saw all of them as candidates. His criterion for recommending the procedure was not narrowly clinical. It was, in his own words, aimed at patients who were suffering unnecessarily, and his definition of unnecessary suffering
was broad enough to encompass a very wide range of conditions and people. James Watts had concerns. He expressed them privately, in correspondence that has survived, and occasionally in meetings. The procedure was serious. The risks were real. The outcomes were not consistently positive.
The population of patients being recommended for surgery seemed, to Watts, to be expanding beyond the bounds of clinical justification. Freeman heard these concerns. He did not change course. It is important to resist the temptation of retrospective simplicity here. Walter Freeman was not, by most accounts, a malicious person. He was not operating from a desire to harm. He believed, with a conviction that seems to have been entirely genuine, that he was relieving suffering. He had watched patients who had been miserable for years emerge from surgery calmer, quieter, no longer in the grip of the particular torments that had consumed them. He had read their charts and heard their families express gratitude. He had, in his own framework, seen the evidence.
What he had not done, what perhaps he was constitutionally unable to do, was ask whether what he was seeing was actually healing. Whether the calm that followed surgery represented the relief of suffering, or the abolition of the self that had been suffering. Whether the patients who emerged quieter were better, or simply less. There is a version of certainty that is indistinguishable from blindness.
In 1936, Walter Freeman and James Watts had performed one lobotomy together. By 1940, they had performed 100. By 1945, the procedure had been adopted at major psychiatric institutions across the United States. Surgeons in New York, California, Georgia, Ohio, and dozens of other states were performing versions of it, some closely following the Freeman-Watts standard, others improvising. The procedure had crossed institutional lines, moved into private practice, and begun appearing in the records of hospitals that had never previously performed brain surgery of any kind. The surgical technique of this early period was demanding. It required general anesthesia, which meant an anesthesiologist. It required drilling burr holes through the skull, which required a surgical suite, sterilization protocols, trained nursing staff, and a neurosurgeon.
It required significant recovery time. It was expensive. It was slow. And it carried real risks: infection, hemorrhage, seizure, death. The mortality rate in Freeman and Watts's own series hovered around 2 to 3% in the early years. For every 30 or 40 patients who survived, 1 or 2 did not. These were not trivial numbers. And yet the procedure spread. Why? The answer:
violence was not uncommon. Escapes happened. Suicides happened. The daily reality of running a large psychiatric institution in this era was one of constant management of crises with inadequate tools. Into this environment came the lobotomy, and the lobotomy did do something. It did reliably change patients. The patients who underwent the procedure emerged, in most cases, quieter, less agitated, less likely to throw things or scream or attempt to harm themselves or others, less demanding of staff attention, more manageable. The medical literature of the period reflects this in language that is striking in retrospect. Patient no longer combative. Patient cooperative with ward routine. Patient has ceased to exhibit aggressive behavior. Patient accepts restrictions without protest.
These phrases appear in institutional reports, in case summaries, in the brief notations that physicians made in the margins of patient files. They were offered as evidence of improvement. They described changes in behavior that made the patient easier to manage. They did not describe, could not describe, because the outcomes were not being measured that way, what had happened to the person underneath the behavior. What had happened was more complicated.
In the cases where the lobotomy's effects have been documented in enough detail to reconstruct, and these are often the cases of patients who had articulate families, or who later became capable of writing about their own experience, or who came to the attention of later researchers, the picture that emerges is not simply one of agitation replaced by calm. It is one of a person fundamentally altered in ways that extended far beyond the presenting symptoms. Patients lost the ability to plan for the future.
Not in the dramatic sense of being incapable of thought, but in the subtler sense of no longer being able to hold a future self in mind, to imagine what they would want next week, next year, to understand that current actions had consequences that would arrive later. This deficit appeared reliably in neuropsychological assessments when those assessments were done, which in the institutional setting they usually were not. Patients lost emotional range. The agitation disappeared, but so did the joy, the curiosity, the affection, the ambition. The particular color and texture of a personality, built across a lifetime of experience, was flattened into something that functioned, but did not, in any recognizable sense, feel.
They stopped, in many cases, expressing preferences of any kind. They ate what was placed in front of them. They did what they were told. They did not resist, because resistance requires the kind of internally motivated disagreement that the surgery had made difficult or impossible. And then the physicians wrote in their charts, patient cooperative with ward routine. Patient no longer combative. There is a question embedded in all of this that the institutional framework was not designed to ask. The framework was designed to manage behavior. The question it could not ask, or refuse to ask, was this: whose behavior exactly was being managed, and for whose benefit? Because the patients who became cooperative after lobotomy were not experiencing less distress in any measurable way.
They were experiencing less visible distress. The suffering had not been resolved. The capacity to express it had been removed. Compliance was being transcribed as cure. By the mid-1940s, the procedure had accumulated enough momentum to carry itself. Individual physicians did not need to be convinced of the theory anymore. They simply needed to see that other physicians were doing it, that the journals were publishing positive reports, that the institutions that had adopted the procedure were reporting reduced agitation in their patient populations. The social mechanism of medical adoption had engaged, and it was moving faster than the evidence that would eventually stop it. It should be said that not everyone in medicine was uncritical.
There were neurologists and psychiatrists who expressed serious reservations, who pointed in print to the absence of controlled trials, to the inadequacy of outcome measures, to the suspiciously convenient alignment between what the surgery produced and what institutional management required. These voices were in the minority, but they were not silent. They were also not listened to. Not yet. Freeman, meanwhile, was already thinking beyond the technique he had developed with Watts. The burr holes, the general anesthesia, the neurosurgeon, the surgical suite, all of this seemed to him increasingly like unnecessary friction. The procedure was too slow. It reached too few people.
The 400,000 patients in American psychiatric hospitals could not, at the current rate of adoption, ever be reached by a surgery that required this much infrastructure. He was thinking, in other words, about scale. He was imagining a version of the procedure that could be done anywhere, in a standard examining room, without a surgical team, without a hospital. Something that any physician could learn, that could be applied quickly, that would not require the patient to be admitted to a surgical ward for recovery. Something efficient.
Something democratic, as he would later call it. A treatment that could reach the patients who needed it most, the ones languishing in the overcrowded back wards of underfunded state hospitals, the ones who had been waiting years for any intervention at all. He began thinking about the eye socket. He had read the work of an Italian physician, Amaro Fiamberti, who had experimented with reaching the frontal lobes through the thin bone above the eyeball, a route that avoided the skull entirely, that required no drill, that provided direct access to the white matter of the prefrontal cortex through a path the body had already built. Freeman experimented, first on cadavers, then on patients.
In 1945, he performed the first transorbital lobotomy in the United States, using a modified icepick, a kitchen icepick, by some accounts, purchased from a hardware store and modified in his laboratory, inserted through the eye socket, above the eyeball, through the thin bone behind it, and into the frontal lobe. The procedure took approximately 10 minutes. It required no drill, no neurosurgeon, no operating room. James Watts refused to participate. He told Freeman that what he was proposing was not surgery. It was a crude assault on the brain, performed without adequate training, without adequate sterility, without adequate oversight. Their collaboration effectively ended. They would part formally, not long after. Freeman did not stop. He had found his answer to the problem of scale.
The icepick, the mallet, the 10-minute procedure that could be done anywhere, by anyone willing to learn it on any patient whose family or physician decided they needed it. There were tens of thousands of patients waiting in the asylums of America. Freeman intended to reach them. Freeman wanted to take psychiatry out of the asylum and into the office. The transorbital lobotomy was his answer. It required only an icepick and a mallet.
Freeman wanted to take psychiatry out of the asylum and into the office. The transorbital lobotomy was his answer. It required only an icepick and a mallet. For 10 years, from 1936 to 1945, The standard lobotomy in America was a serious surgical event. A patient would be brought into an operating theater. A hole, sometimes two holes, one on each side of the skull, would be drilled with a surgical burr. There would be full anesthetic, a scrubbed surgical team, bright overhead lights, a neurosurgeon in attendance, and the particular silence of a room where something irreversible is about to happen. The operation took hours. It required trained hands, a sterile field and equipment that only a hospital could provide.
And when it was over, the patient would be moved to a recovery ward and watched for days. Walter Freeman found this deeply inconvenient, not because he personally lacked access to operating theaters. He had access. He was on staff at George Washington University Hospital in Washington, D.C. He had colleagues who were neurosurgeons, and he had James Watts, his longtime surgical partner, who could and did perform the cranial procedure. What Freeman lacked was scale. And scale was, to Freeman, everything. There were, by his own calculation, hundreds of thousands of patients warehoused in American psychiatric institutions in the 1940s. 40,000 had become the figure routinely cited for 1938. 40,000 people committed to state mental hospitals. Some estimates put the true figure considerably higher.
These institutions were chronically overcrowded, perpetually underfunded, and staffed by doctors who had, in the plain, honest reckoning of what medicine could offer, almost nothing. Sedatives, restraints, isolation rooms, electroconvulsive therapy, which had become widespread through the late 1930s, and which helped some patients and harmed others, and which cured no one. Insulin coma therapy, which required nurses to induce dangerous hypoglycemic states in patients and then revive them, repeatedly, in the belief that the coma somehow reset disordered thinking. The results of insulin coma were ambiguous. The risks were real. The evidence by any contemporary standard was almost non-existent. Freeman believed he had something better.
He had seen it work, or believed he had seen it work, in the patients he and Watts had operated on since 1936. He had watched agitated, screaming patients become calm. He had watched people who had spent years tied to beds walk quietly through hospital wards. He had visited them afterward, years later in some cases, and found them living in the world, not thriving necessarily, not fully themselves in the way they had been before, but out of the institution, out of the locked ward, back in some version of ordinary life.
The answer arrived indirectly from Italy. An Italian physician named Amaro Fiamberti had experimented in the 1937 and 1938 period with reaching the frontal lobes through a different route entirely, not through the skull, but through the thin bone at the roof of the eye socket. The eye socket is not, as most people assume, a solid bony structure. At the top of each orbit, where the eyelid terminates and the skull begins, there is a thin plate of bone called the orbital plate of the frontal bone. In many people, this plate is delicate, almost fragile, and behind it,
separated from the back of the eye socket by only a few centimeters of tissue, are the frontal lobes of the brain.
Fiamberti had inserted a needle through this root to inject alcohol and formalin into the frontal lobes, a crude chemical attempt to achieve what the surgical procedure accomplished by cutting. His results were not impressive, but the anatomical insight that there was a route to the frontal lobes that bypassed the skull entirely was not lost on Freeman. He took the idea. He refined it. He built a procedure around it. He designed an instrument he called the orbitoclast. But anyone who ever saw it described it the same way. It looked like an icepick, because it was, in its essential geometry, exactly an icepick. A handle, a shaft, and a pointed tip designed to penetrate.
The first instruments Freeman used in his initial trials in 1945 were in fact household ice picks. The kind used to chip blocks of ice before mechanical refrigeration became universal. He ordered them from a kitchen supply catalog. He later had a stainless steel medical version manufactured, with gradations marked along the shaft so he could measure how deep he had inserted it. But the geometry never changed. The procedure worked like this. A patient was first rendered unconscious, not through conventional surgical anesthesia, no endotracheal tube, no gas, no anesthesiologist in attendance. Through electroconvulsive shock, 2 electrodes were placed on the temples. A precise electrical current was passed through.
The patient would convulse briefly and then go limp, unconscious, in the particular unfocused way that follows an electrically induced seizure. This window of unconsciousness lasted somewhere between 10 and 30 seconds. That was the window Freeman worked in. He would lift the upper eyelid of the patient. He would place the pointed tip of the orbitoclast against the bone at the superior rim of the eye socket, the thinnest part, the orbital plate. Then he would use a small surgical mallet, or sometimes just the heel of his hand, to tap the instrument through the bone. It did not require much force. The bone was thin. The instrument entered the space behind the eye.
Freeman would then angle the shaft upward and slightly inward toward the prefrontal cortex. He would move it laterally, side to side, in a motion he sometimes described as sweeping. The movement severed the white matter connections between the prefrontal cortex and the thalamus, the relay station deep in the brain that Freeman and Moniz before him believed was the seat of the disordered neural circuits that produced psychiatric symptoms. Then he would withdraw the instrument, cross to the other eye, and repeat the process on the other side. Total elapsed time from the moment the shock electrodes were applied to the moment Freeman stepped back, approximately 10 minutes. The patient would regain consciousness, usually within a few minutes, often confused, often disoriented.
Sometimes weeping, though unable to say why, sometimes calm in a way that the nursing staff would describe in their notes as pleasant or cooperative. There was no surgical wound that required suturing. There was bruising around both eyes, black eyes, essentially, that would develop over the following hours and persist for several days. Freeman told patients and their families, when he told them anything, that the procedure was minor, that the recovery was fast, that the bruising around the eyes was cosmetic and temporary. He compared it, more than once, to a visit to the dentist. He may have genuinely believed this. The gap between what Freeman believed he was doing and what he was actually doing was perhaps the defining feature of his career.
Here is what the change from prefrontal to transorbital actually meant, in practical terms.
Before the transorbital technique, a lobotomy required, a trained neurosurgeon, a general anesthesiologist, a sterile surgical suite, a hospital equipped to manage the complications of intracranial surgery, a postoperative ward, days of recovery time, and in total, a medical infrastructure that was simply not available in most American psychiatric hospitals in the 1940s. State hospitals were not surgical centers. They were holding facilities, for the most part, staffed by overworked psychiatrists with almost no surgical capacity. After the transorbital technique, a lobotomy required, Walter Freeman, an orbitoclast, a mallet, and an electrical outlet for the shock machine. That was it. No operating room, no sterile field, no neurosurgeon, no anesthesiologist.
Freeman could, and did, perform the transorbital procedure in a psychiatric hospital's regular examination room, in a converted office, in whatever space was available when he arrived. He called this democratization. He meant it as the highest possible compliment. There is a certain kind of optimism that becomes its own form of danger, precisely because it is entirely sincere. Freeman was not performing the transorbital lobotomy in secret. He photographed every procedure. He documented every step. He demonstrated the technique openly, in front of colleagues, in front of medical students, in front of journalists and photographers who published their accounts in newspapers and popular magazines. The technique was not hidden. It was promoted. He wrote it up in peer-reviewed journals. He presented it at conferences.
He trained other physicians. He believed with the full force of a man who had spent a decade building toward this moment, that he had solved a problem that had haunted psychiatry since it became a medical specialty, the problem of scale, of access, of too many suffering people and too few tools to help them. What he had actually accomplished was removing every barrier, every surgical requirement, every credentialing gatekeep, every physical and institutional checkpoint between a doctor's impulse and a patient's brain. Simplification, in the wrong context, is not progress. Sometimes it is just speed. Speed, and the particular confidence of a man who has mistaken efficiency for wisdom.
By 1952, Walter Freeman had a vehicle. He had purchased a van, a camper-style vehicle he could sleep in, drive across state lines, and park outside the sprawling campuses of state psychiatric hospitals. He called it his lobotomobile. He was not embarrassed by the name. He used it in correspondence. He mentioned it in lectures. He was proud of the image it conveyed. A physician so committed to his patients, so determined to bring his treatment to the people who needed it, that he had taken his practice on the road. The lobotomy tours were methodical. Freeman had spent years mapping the geography of American state psychiatric institutions.
He knew which hospital superintendents were sympathetic to his approach, which were skeptical, and which were desperate enough to agree to anything. He knew which states had the most severely overcrowded facilities: West Virginia, California, Washington, Virginia. And which had psychiatrists who had been following his published work
and wanted to see the transorbital technique demonstrated in person. He planned his routes. He wrote letters in advance. He showed up, usually with his instrument.
Staff who had been spending their shifts managing aggression could redirect their attention elsewhere. By the metrics that institutional administrators used to evaluate whether a psychiatric ward was functioning well, and the metrics were, almost universally, metrics of order and compliance, the transorbital lobotomy worked. Reports that traveled up to state boards and funding committees described patients as markedly improved, manageable, no longer a danger to themselves or others. These phrases appear again and again in the institutional records of the 1940s and 1950s. They do not appear alongside descriptions of what, specifically, had been removed from the patients in order to achieve this improvement. In 1952, at Weston State Hospital in West Virginia, Freeman performed 25 transorbital lobotomies in a single day. One after another. He worked through the morning and into the afternoon. He moved from patient to patient with the focused efficiency of someone who had performed this procedure thousands of times and had long since stopped thinking of it as something unusual. He kept careful notes on each patient. He took photographs, before and after. He was, by the accounts of those who observed him on these tours, calm throughout, unhurried, professional. At the end of the day, he reviewed his notes, ate dinner, and slept in the lobotomobile. By Freeman's own meticulously kept records, he personally performed approximately 3,400 lobotomies over the course of his career, spanning from 1936 to 1967. 3,400. He kept a file on every patient.
He sent follow-up letters to their families. He visited former patients when his travels brought him near their homes or institutions. He collected their stories with the dedication of a man who was building a case for the legitimacy of his life's work. He wanted to show that they had been helped. He believed they had been helped. What he was not, perhaps, was able to see them clearly enough to know the difference between being helped and being changed in ways that looked, from the outside, like improvement. Across the United States as a whole, the numbers tell their own story. Between 1936 and the early 1960s, approximately 40,000 to 50,000 lobotomies were performed on American patients.
The figures are estimates. Record-keeping was inconsistent across state hospital systems, and many procedures in smaller or more rural facilities were never formally logged in any centralized database. But the broad scale is not in dispute among historians of medicine. In 1949 alone, a single year, roughly 5,000 lobotomies were performed in America. That is approximately 100 a week, 14 a day.
In Britain, in the same period, tens of thousands of additional procedures were carried out under the influence of the same clinical enthusiasm. The pattern repeated across Western Europe, in parts of Latin America, in Japan. What had begun as an experimental procedure in a Lisbon hospital in 1935 had become, within 15 years,
a global medical practice affecting hundreds of thousands of human lives. A question worth sitting with for a moment. How does a procedure this radical become this routine? The answer requires a kind of honesty about the way medical systems actually function. Not as they are idealized in textbooks, but as they work under pressure, in real institutions, with real resource constraints and real human desperation driving the decisions that get made.
The answer is not that the physicians involved were villains. The answer is not that the families who consented to these procedures did not love the people they were consenting for. The answer is that a system was under enormous, crushing pressure. The pressure of 200,000 patients in facilities designed to hold half that number. The pressure of families with no other options. The pressure of administrators trying to justify budgets. The pressure of a field that was desperate to be seen as doing something. And into that system came a procedure that appeared to offer relief. Not for the patients, necessarily, for the system. For the administrators who needed their wards manageable.
For the families who needed their relatives to be, in some basic practical sense, possible to live alongside. For the psychiatrists who needed to believe that what they were doing constituted medicine. Freeman gave all of them something they needed very badly. He gave them the appearance of a solution. There is a version of medicine that is, at its root, the management of inconvenience. When someone is suffering in a way that is disruptive, to a family, to an institution, to a community, the pressure on doctors is not simply to cure them. The pressure is to make them easier to be around. This is not a cynical observation. It reflects something real about how human beings relate to suffering that they cannot fix. The tendency to address the disruption rather than its source, because the source is intractable and the disruption is immediate. The transorbital lobotomy was extraordinary at addressing the disruption. It did not cure depression. It did not eliminate psychosis. It did not resolve the traumas and biochemical processes and social conditions that produced the suffering in the first place. What it did, reliably and consistently, was lower the emotional volume of a person. It made them quieter. It made them less resistant. It made them more compliant. It made them, in the institutional vocabulary of mid-century America, manageable. And 1950 America was routinely written down as cured.
The language of the era matters enormously here, because it is in the language that the self-deception lived. When a hospital record described a formerly agitated patient as no longer exhibiting aggressive behavior, it did not note that the patient now spent 12 hours a day sitting in a chair without speaking to anyone.
When a family wrote back to Freeman to tell him their relative seemed so much calmer, they often did not mention, could not quite bring themselves to articulate, that the relative had stopped recognizing them, or had stopped caring about the things that used to make them laugh, or seemed to inhabit their body in a way that felt, to everyone who loved them, like something essential was missing, but no one could say precisely what. The clinical instruments of the era were not designed to capture what was missing. They were designed to capture what was present. And what was present: reduced agitation, reduced resistance, reduced emotional volatility. Looked very much like improvement. Freeman knew about the failures.
He documented them in his files with the same meticulous attention he gave the successes. Some patients died. The mortality rate for the transorbital procedure across Freeman's own case series ran at approximately 1 to 2%. 1 to 2% of 3,400 operations. Do that arithmetic. Somewhere between 34 and 68 deaths attributable, in a reasonable medical accounting, to procedures Freeman himself performed. He also knew about the cases he called vegetative, patients who emerged from the procedure without personality, without initiative, without the animating quality that makes a person recognizably themselves. He acknowledged these outcomes in his writing. He weighed them, as he put it, against the suffering that had existed before.
He calculated that the math still worked out in favor of the procedure. He may have been doing his calculation correctly, given the data he had. The question is whether the data he had was the right data. Perhaps the most unsettling thing about Walter Freeman, viewed across the full span of his career, is not that he was wrong. It is that he was wrong in a way that looked, from inside his own perspective, so much like being right. He had files. He had photographs. He had follow-up letters. He had 30 years of patient histories. He had the gratitude of families who had been at their wits' end and were now managing. He had the relief of hospital administrators who had wards they could actually run.
He believed with the full, unquestioning conviction of a man who has organized his entire professional identity around a single insight, that he had helped more people than he had harmed. Whether that belief was accurate is something historians of medicine still disagree about. What is not debated is that the patients themselves were rarely in a position to contribute their perspective to the question. In the autumn of 1941, a young woman of 23 was taken to a hospital in Washington, D.C. She went, so far as the historical record shows, without a clear understanding of what was about to happen. She had not been told, in any meaningful way, what the procedure involved. She had not been asked, in any way that allowed for refusal, whether she consented. Her name was Rosemary Kennedy. Rosemary was the third child born to Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, and the first daughter. She had been born, as the family would learn gradually over her first years, with a mild intellectual disability. The consequence, most likely, of oxygen deprivation during a prolonged and poorly managed labor.
There is a version of the story that attributes the damage to a nurse who held back Rosemary's delivery for 2 hours while waiting for the doctor to arrive. Whether that specific account is accurate is disputed. What is not disputed is that Rosemary Kennedy entered the world with a brain that would develop differently from her siblings' brains, and that her family, in particular her father, would spend much of the rest of her life trying to manage what that meant. The Kennedys were not a family that accommodated limitation easily. Joseph Kennedy had constructed, with ferocious, deliberate effort, a family identity built on competition, achievement, and the appearance of power. His sons were being prepared for political careers.
His daughters were being groomed for the kind of strategic marriages that would extend the family's social reach. Into this environment, Rosemary arrived, warm, affectionate, musical, and constitutionally unable to perform at the level her family's ambitions required. She was enrolled in special schools, given tutors, assigned companions who helped her navigate the social situations that her disability made difficult. She learned to read, after a fashion. She could write letters. She danced. She could hold a conversation, particularly about subjects she cared about. She was, by the accounts of people who knew her in her teens and early 20s,
a genuinely likable young woman who had worked hard and come a long way from the silent, struggling child she had been.
But as she moved through her early 20s, something shifted. The mood swings that had always been part of her disposition became more pronounced. She became, at times, erratic. She would leave the convent school where she was living in Washington, D.C., a school that had been carefully chosen because it could provide both the structure she needed and the social cover that allowed the family to describe her as away at school and wander at night. Sometimes she would be found miles from the convent. She began to exhibit behavior that the nuns who supervised her found alarming. There were outbursts. There were periods of what her caretakers described as uncontrollable rage.
And underneath the specific incidents was a broader problem that Joseph Kennedy could feel even when he could not quite name it. Rosemary was becoming, in his calculus, a liability. Not just a personal difficulty, a liability to the family's ambitions, to the political futures he was engineering for his sons, to the carefully maintained public image of the Kennedys as America's most photogenic, most vigorous, most impeccably managed family. Joseph Kennedy made a decision. He did not consult Rose Kennedy. He did not tell Rose Kennedy. He arranged everything himself, with the directness of a man who had spent his career making decisions that other people would execute. He contacted Walter Freeman and James Watts.
Freeman and Watts had been partners for 5 years at this point. The pair who had introduced the prefrontal lobotomy to America in 1936 and who had spent the intervening years refining and promoting the procedure. This was before Freeman's transorbital innovation. Rosemary Kennedy would receive the older, more invasive procedure, the cranial version, with the patient under anesthesia, a hole drilled in the skull, the connections to the frontal lobe severed through the opening. James Watts later wrote about the procedure. His account, included in his memoir and referenced in multiple historical reconstructions of the Kennedy case, is one of the most disturbing passages in the literature of American medical history. As Watts operated, Freeman stood at Rosemary's bedside.
She had been placed under local anesthesia, conscious but with her pain managed. Freeman kept her talking. He asked her to recite things she knew. The Lord's Prayer, nursery rhymes, poems she had learned as a child. He asked her to count numbers in sequence. He asked her to sing. She did these things. She recited. She sang. She counted. And as she spoke, Watts continued to cut. He swept the cutting instrument through the white matter of her frontal lobes. He watched for the signal Freeman had told him to watch for.
And at a certain point, at the moment when Rosemary's words began to fragment, to lose their coherence, to become the scattered sounds of someone who could no longer quite hold the thread of language, Watts stopped. He had been told to stop when the speech became incoherent. That was the clinical endpoint, the moment when the patient's output indicated that sufficient neural material had been severed. But the reconstruction of events suggests that by the time Watts stopped, the damage had already exceeded what anyone in that room had intended. Rosemary Kennedy was taken from that room a different person. She could no longer walk without assistance. She could no longer speak clearly enough to hold a conversation. She had lost control of basic motor functions.
She was incontinent. She required full-time care. The mild intellectual disability that her family had spent decades helping her manage. The volatility that had led Joseph Kennedy to this decision. Those were gone, yes. But so was everything else. The warmth, the music, the hard-won capability. The 23 years of work that Rosemary herself had put into becoming a person who could navigate a world that was not built for her. All of it gone in a morning. Joseph Kennedy arranged for Rosemary to be transferred to St. Coletta's School for Exceptional Children, a Catholic institution in Jefferson, Wisconsin. He told almost no one what had happened.
He told Rose Kennedy, who had not been informed of the operation before it took place, something vague about he did not expect Rose. Okay. It's over.
For nearly 2 decades, the family's public answer to questions about Rosemary was that she was away at school. Rosemary Kennedy lived at St. Coletta's for 64 years. She died there in January of 2005 at the age of 86. In her later years, after the family's silence began to crack, first in a 1961 article in Life magazine that mentioned her disability without discussing the lobotomy, and then more fully in the decades that followed, she was visited by her siblings. John Kennedy visited. So did Robert. So did Eunice, the sister who was perhaps closest to her. By all accounts, those visits were complicated. Rosemary recognized her siblings sometimes. Sometimes she did not. She had her good days and her difficult ones.
She had developed over the decades her own routines, her own preferences, a life of sorts within the structure that St. Coletta's provided. But she was not the person she had been. And everyone who visited her knew it. There is a particular violence in what happened to Rosemary Kennedy that extends beyond the surgical fact. She was not someone who lacked the capacity to communicate. She could speak. She could write. She could express preferences. She had, by the time the operation was arranged, years of demonstrated capability in navigating her own life within the limits that her disability imposed. She was not consulted, not asked, not told, in any way that constituted genuine informed consent, what was about to happen. Her father decided. Her doctors agreed.
The procedure was performed, and the woman who had existed up to that morning in 1941, the one who had worked so hard and come so far, was, in any meaningful sense, erased, not by illness, by intervention. The ripples of that decision extended far beyond Rosemary's own life. Her sister Eunice Kennedy Shriver would spend the rest of her long life trying to build something in answer to what had been done, trying to create a world where people with intellectual disabilities were included rather than managed, celebrated rather than hidden. The Special Olympics, which Eunice founded in 1968, grew from a backyard camp at her Maryland home into one of the largest sports organizations in the world.
Eunice rarely spoke directly, in public, about Rosemary's lobotomy as the animating grief behind this work. But those who knew the family closely said it was always there. The knowledge of what a family with resources and love and the best medical advice of the era had done to someone they were trying to protect.
and the fierce determination that whatever the world did with its most vulnerable members, it would not be that.
Rosemary Kennedy had a famous name. That is why we know her story with the specificity we do. But she was not unusual. She was, in the most important ways, entirely typical. She was a young woman. She had a family member who found her behavior difficult to manage. She had a physician willing to perform a procedure that promised to resolve the difficulty. She was not asked. The history of the lobotomy era, examined patient by patient rather than statistic by statistic, is largely and overwhelmingly a history of people who were never asked. Not asked whether they wanted this done. Not asked what frightened them. Not asked what they valued.
Not asked what life had felt like before their illness, or what they hoped it might feel like if they got better. Not asked, most crucially, whether they were willing to trade whatever the procedure would take from them for whatever peace it might offer in return. The question was structural. It was built into the law, into the medical culture, into the way institutions organized the relationship between doctors and patients in that era. And the answer that the law and the culture and the institutions had arrived at, for patients committed to psychiatric facilities, was, the question does not need to be posed. The legal framework that made this possible was not a secret conspiracy.
It was an explicit legal architecture that had been constructed over decades, in state after state, out of a genuine, if catastrophically misguided, attempt to manage the problem of people whose judgment was, by definition, deemed unreliable. In most American states in the 1940s and 1950s, a person who had been involuntarily committed to a psychiatric institution had no legal standing to refuse medical treatment. They could not vote. They could not enter contracts. They could not, in most jurisdictions, petition a court for release on their own behalf without the assistance of a lawyer who was willing to take the case. And they could not refuse procedures that their physician and their legal guardian, in most cases, a family member, had jointly agreed to authorize. The reasoning was circular, and its circularity was the point. You could not trust the judgment of someone whose judgment was by legal definition impaired. Therefore, their judgment did not need to be consulted. Therefore, the decision moved outward to those who were deemed competent to make it.
This pattern is consistent across American, British, and European data from the peak period of the procedure. The diagnoses that appear most frequently in the patient files of female lobotomy recipients are not the diagnoses we might expect. Not acute psychosis, not violent mania, not the most severe and disabling presentations of serious mental illness. The diagnoses are emotional instability, excessive anxiety, sexual misconduct, hysteria, and appearing in institutional files with a frequency that is difficult to look at without a particular kind of anger, the phrase, difficult to manage at home. Difficult to manage at home. That phrase is worth holding. It is not a medical diagnosis. It does not describe a neurological state. It does not tell us anything about what was happening inside a patient's mind.
It describes a relationship. It describes a social situation in which one person, usually a woman, was behaving in ways that the people around her found inconvenient, exhausting, or disruptive to the functioning of the household. She might have been genuinely and severely mentally ill. She might also have been grieving. She might have been in an abusive marriage. She might have been suffering from what we would now recognize as postpartum depression, or PTSD, or a mood disorder that was entirely treatable if it had been treated with anything other than the scar tissue left by an icepick sweeping through the frontal lobes. The distinction in the medical culture of the 1940s and 1950s was often not made, because the distinction was not required.
What was required was that the behavior change, and the lobotomy changed it. Howard Dully was 12 years old in 1960. He is among the youngest known recipients of a transorbital lobotomy administered by Walter Freeman, and he is among the very few survivors of the lobotomy era who have spoken about the experience in their own words at length. In 2005, Dully collaborated with the journalist Charles Fleming and the radio journalist Joe Richman on an NPR documentary called My Lobotomy. The documentary was broadcast on All Things Considered and became one of the most listened to radio documentaries in NPR's history. 2 years after the documentary aired, Dully published a memoir with the same title. Dully was born in 1948 in San Jose, California.
His mother died when he was 5 years old. His father remarried, and his stepmother, Lou, found Howard difficult from the beginning. By Howard's own account, and by the account that emerges from reading Freeman's clinical notes, he was an ordinary, energetic boy, perhaps more headstrong than some children, perhaps slower to comply with requests he didn't see the point of. The kind of child who asked too many questions and didn't sit still. The kind of child who exists in every family. Lou found him impossible. She brought him to Freeman's office multiple times, beginning in 1958, when Howard was 10 years old. She described his behavior in clinical terms that, by Freeman's standards, constituted sufficient justification for intervention. She said he was defiant.
That he didn't listen, that he was strange, that he frightened her. Freeman's notes from this period record his clinical impressions of Howard, and they make for uncomfortable reading. He noted that Howard seemed not very bright, that he showed no affect, that he had no particular interests. He also noted, in the same clinical shorthand, that the principal reason for surgery was the stepmother's desire. He wrote this. He read it back, and then he scheduled the operation. On December 16, 1960, Howard Dully was 12 years old. He was taken to Freeman's office. He was not told what was going to happen. He was given 2 electroconvulsive shocks. He lost consciousness. When he woke up, the procedure had been performed. He was driven home.
His stepmother did not tell him what had been done to him. His father did not tell him. For years, Howard lived with the knowledge that something had happened to him, something that the adults in his life would not explain, and with the unarticulated sense that whatever it was had changed him in ways he could not name. In his memoir, Dully describes searching, throughout his childhood and adolescence and young adulthood, for whatever it was that the operation had taken. The frustration, he writes, is that you cannot identify what is missing because it is gone. You only know that something should be there, and isn't. He went on to live a long and complicated life. There were years of homelessness, years of alcohol.
Periods of institutionalization. And eventually, in his 50s, a measure of stability, he drives a bus in the San Francisco Bay Area. He has a family. He has told his story now to millions of people. He was 12 years old. He was not asked. Naomi Ginsburg came from a different world. She was the mother of Allen Ginsberg, who would become one of the defining voices of post-war American literature. And she had been ill, in one way or another, for much of Allen's childhood. Paranoid episodes, hospitalizations, periods of terrifying intensity, followed by periods of quiet. The kind of illness that consumed a family from the inside, slowly, over years. In 1947, Naomi Ginsburg received a lobotomy. Allen was 21 years old.
He had by that point been his mother's companion and witness and occasional caretaker for most of his conscious life. He would spend the following decades trying to write about what that meant, trying to find language adequate to what it was like to love someone whose mind had become a place she could not always find her way back from. Kaddish, published in 1961, the long poem Allen Ginsberg wrote in memory of his mother, is many things. It is a Jewish morning prayer. It is a son's elegy. It is a catalogue of the specific, unglamorous, unsentimentalized details of what it looks like to watch a person you love be consumed by mental illness over the course of decades.
It does not make a political argument about lobotomy. It does not position itself as a critique of Freeman or Moniz or the medical establishment of the 1940s. But it does something that virtually none of the clinical literature of the era manages to do. It asks what it felt like to be Naomi, not what her doctors thought she was experiencing, not what her diagnosis category suggested about her likely prognosis. What it actually felt like from inside to live in a mind that did what Naomi's mind did to her. And what it felt like to be a child inside the radius of that.
To watch her be taken away and brought back and taken away again. To watch the treatments that were supposed to help her and to live with the question of whether they had. Kaddish is, among other things, a document of what the entire lobotomy era looked like from inside a family that was trying to do right by someone the era did not know how to treat. It is the record of the experience from the side that the clinical files never recorded.
Freeman's case records include procedures performed on patients who were, by any reasonable standard, children. The youngest documented cases involved patients as young as 4 years old, children institutionalized with diagnoses of childhood schizophrenia, severe behavioral disorders,
or what the clinical vocabulary of the period called childhood dementia. These were diagnoses applied with breathtaking looseness. A child who was aggressive, hyperactive, and unresponsive to institutional routines might find themselves described in the paperwork of a 1950s state hospital in language that made a referral to Freeman's clinic seem medically reasonable. The children could not consent. Their parents consented on their behalf. Their physicians signed off on the procedure, and the children experienced what followed.
One of the things that makes this history most difficult to sit with is that the people who arranged these procedures were not, in most cases, acting with cruelty. The cruelty was systemic. The individuals were, most of them, trying to help. The parents who signed consent forms for their children's lobotomies had often spent years watching their children suffer in ways that no available treatment was reaching. They had tried the other things: the drugs, the therapy, the institutional care, the special schools. They were exhausted, frightened, and out of options. Freeman offered them something. They said yes. The spouses and parents who signed consent for adult patients had often been living for years inside relationships that mental illness had made unrecognizable.
They loved the person they had married or the person who had been their child. They could no longer find that person through the illness. Freeman told them he could help. They said yes. And Freeman himself believed. He believed in the procedure, believed in his data, believed in the follow-up letters, believed in the patients he visited who recognized him and thanked him. He believed genuinely and consistently and until the end of his life that the ledger balanced in favor of what he had done. He was a man acting from conviction. And yet all of that good intention, the desperate parents, the exhausted spouses, the convinced and driven physician, existed alongside the complete, structural, legally enforced absence of the patient's own voice.
The patient was the center of all this concern. The patient's suffering was the reason for every decision that was made. The patient was the subject of the case file and the clinical report and the follow-up letter and the institutional assessment. And the patient was the one person whose perspective on what was being done to them was systematically, structurally, and legally excluded from the decision. This is not ultimately a story about evil. Evil is, in some ways, easier to account for than this.
This is a story about how good intentions, combined with unchecked institutional authority and the desperate need to believe that something you are doing is working, can produce outcomes that no one involved would have consciously chosen if they had been forced to look clearly at what they were actually doing. It is a story about a system that had organized itself with the best available intentions in a way that made it structurally impossible to hear the people it claimed to be serving. Most of the 40,000 to 50,000 people who received lobotomies in the United States left no detailed account of what it felt like from inside. They went into those rooms. They came out changed. The world called it treatment. The paperwork called it improvement. And the thing that had been taken, the specific texture of who they had been, the particular quality of their inner experience before the Orbata class swept through, was not recorded anywhere, because no one with a clipboard and a form was asking about that. A handful of voices survived and spoke. Howard Dully wrote his book. Allen Ginsberg wrote his poem. Rosemary Kennedy's family eventually broke their silence, and a fuller picture of what had been done to her came slowly into view. Other survivors, in the 1970s and 1980s, as the patient rights movement found its footing, came forward with their accounts. Their stories are incomplete.
They are partial reconstructions of experiences that the people who lived them often could not fully articulate. Because what the lobotomy had taken was sometimes the very capacity for certain kinds of self-reflection. But they are what we have. They are the records from inside. And what those records tell us, collectively, is something that the clinical literature of the era was never designed to capture. They tell us that something happened to these people. Not just a neurological event, not just a psychiatric intervention. Something happened to them, specifically, individually, irreversibly. And they were never asked whether they agreed. They were modified, because the people around them found them difficult, because the system needed them to be manageable.
Because medicine, in that moment in history, had a tool that seemed to solve the problem. And the problem was not, in the end, suffering. The problem was inconvenience. This is what the lobotomy era looks like when you move from the statistics to the individuals. Not a scandal, not a conspiracy, a failure of imagination. A failure to ask the one question that should have been primary. Not, will this make the patient easier to live with? But, what does the patient want their life to be? They were never asked. That is the fact at the center of this era that no subsequent reappraisal, no medical history revision, no belated institutional acknowledgement has been able to undo. The question was not posed. The answer was not heard.
And the procedure was performed regardless. And then, in 1952, a French pharmaceutical company synthesized chlorpromazine. It was not a cure, but it was quieter, and it did not require a mallet. And then, in 1952, a French pharmaceutical company synthesized chlorpromazine. It was not a cure, but it was quieter, and it did not require a mallet.
They described it later as a kind of distance from their own anxiety, as if the fear were still there, somewhere behind glass, but they could no longer quite reach it. Laborit brought his observations to psychiatrists at the Val de Grace Military Hospital in Paris. He told them, "This compound does something unusual to the mind. You should look at it." Jean Delay and Pierre Dennecker did look at it. In early 1952, Delay and Dennecker administered chlorpromazine to patients with acute psychosis at the St. Anne Hospital in Paris. The results were documented carefully, methodically, in the way that Moniz's original lobotomy results had never been. Patients who had been agitated, combative, lost inside states that no restraint could reach. They quieted.
Some of them, for the first time in years, were able to hold a conversation. It was not a cure. Delay and Dennecker said so themselves. The symptoms were suppressed, not resolved. The underlying architecture of the illness remained, but the volume had been turned down, and that, in the context of 1952, felt like a revolution. The drug was not simply sitting in a laboratory waiting to be discovered by psychiatrists. There was a pathway, accidental, circuitous, driven by a naval surgeon's curiosity about sedation rather than any deliberate search for a psychiatric breakthrough. That pathway ran through Laborit's operating theater, through the Val de Grace Hospital, through the wards of the St. Anne, and finally across the Atlantic to the offices of American pharmaceutical distribution.
Each link in that chain was contingent. Each could have been broken. The drug that would end the lobotomy era almost didn't reach the people who deployed it in time to matter. By 1954, chlorpromazine had been approved in the United States under the brand name Thorazine. Smith, Klein, and French laboratories distributed it aggressively. They sent samples to psychiatric hospitals. They published literature. They ran educational campaigns for physicians. Within a year, it had been administered to approximately 2 million patients. The effect on hospital populations was immediate and visible. The number of patients admitted to long-term psychiatric facilities in the United States had peaked in 1955 at approximately 558,000. That number had been rising without interruption since the beginning of the century.
After 1955, it began for the first time to fall. Something had changed in the arithmetic of psychiatric care. A patient who could be stabilized on a daily pill was a different kind of patient than one who required years of institutionalization. The economics shifted. The logic shifted. The very concept of what psychiatric treatment was supposed to accomplish began to shift beneath everyone's feet. For Freeman, the timing could not have been worse. He had spent nearly 2 decades building the case for transorbital lobotomy as the most practical, most scalable, most democratic solution to the problem of mental illness. He had argued that the surgery was fast, inexpensive, and effective.
He had driven across the country in his lobotomobile, making that argument with an icepick in his kit and a record book in his lap. And now there was a pill. A pill that was fast, inexpensive, and produced results that were, at minimum, comparable to what he was claiming for his surgeries. And a pill did not require a physician to insert anything through anyone's eye socket. A pill did not carry the risk of seizures, hemorrhage, or death on the table. A pill could be adjusted. Its dose could be reduced if the side effects became too severe. It could be stopped. This was the fundamental asymmetry that chlorpromazine introduced into the debate. Reversibility. A lobotomy could not be undone.
The neural pathways severed by Freeman's leucotome did not regenerate. Whatever the patient lost on that table, they lost permanently. The pill, by contrast, was something you could walk away from. The philosophical weight of that difference was enormous. It meant that when chlorpromazine failed, or when its side effects became intolerable, there was still ground to retreat to. The patient was still, in some technical sense, intact. With lobotomy, there was no such retreat. The surgery was the end of the road. And so, slowly at first, then with gathering speed, the referrals stopped coming. Psychiatrists who had tolerated Freeman's presentations, who had allowed him into their hospitals, who had watched him work and said nothing, now had an alternative to offer their patients and their governing boards.
They took it, not because they had suddenly developed moral objections to what Freeman was doing, but because something easier was available. There was also, for many physicians, a more pragmatic consideration. A medication that failed could be discontinued, a medication whose side effects proved unacceptable. And chlorpromazine had real side effects, among them the involuntary muscle movements that would later be classified as tardive dyskinesia, could be adjusted, substituted, reconsidered. The clinical relationship between physician and patient remained open. There was still room to change course. A lobotomy offered no such flexibility.
If the outcome was wrong, if the personality that emerged from the procedure was not the one anticipated, less agitated, yes, but also less capable, less expressive, less present, there was nothing left to adjust. The relationship between the physician and that particular version of the patient was over. The physician had, in the most literal sense, cut it off. This is the part of the lobotomy story that tends to get lost in the more dramatic accounts. The surgical theater, the icepick, the stunning single-day numbers from West Virginia. The less dramatic truth is that the procedure ended not because it was exposed or condemned, but because it became professionally inconvenient.
Chlorpromazine gave physicians a way to manage the same symptoms with less liability, less effort, and better optics. The abandonment of lobotomy was, in that sense, an institutional calculation, as much as it was a moral one. The history of medicine is full of moments like this. Not the dramatic revelation of wrongdoing, not the public recantation, not the official ban. Just the quiet withdrawal of interest. The procedure that was everywhere, suddenly discussed in the past tense. The patients who had already been operated on were not helped by this shift. They were not given compensation. They were not offered rehabilitation. They were not, in most cases, even acknowledged. The hospitals that had submitted them to the procedure issued no apologies.
The medical boards that had credentialed the surgeons raised no formal objections. The era simply ended, and the people it had consumed remained where they were, changed in ways that could not be reversed, in a world that had moved on without looking back.
James Watts saw it coming before Freeman did. Watts had been Freeman's partner since 1936. It was Watts, a trained neurosurgeon, who had provided the surgical legitimacy for their original collaboration. It was Watts, who had operated while Freeman observed, who had opened skulls and traced the white matter tracts with the technical precision that Freeman, as a neurologist, was not trained to provide. But by the late 1940s, Watts had grown uneasy. The transorbital technique, which Freeman introduced in 1945 without consulting him, troubled Watts deeply. It was performed without full anesthesia. It required no surgical training. It bypassed the safeguards that operating room protocols were designed to provide. Watts saw it not as a democratization of medicine, but as a dismantling of its disciplines.
The disagreements between them accumulated. Watts found himself increasingly unwilling to endorse what Freeman was doing in the field. He watched Freeman perform procedures in settings that Watts considered dangerously inadequate. He saw the patient outcomes that Freeman's triumphant case files did not capture. He saw the ones who came back different in ways that were not improvements. In 1950, Watts walked away. He and Freeman split their practice. Watts continued to perform conventional neurosurgery. Freeman continued alone. The partnership that had given American lobotomy its institutional credibility dissolved without public announcement, without formal explanation.
Freeman simply continued, as he always had, on his own terms. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, he kept going.
The numbers of procedures declined as chlorpromazine spread, and the profession's enthusiasm cooled. But Freeman adapted his argument. He refined his statistics. He reached back into his files for cases he could point to as evidence of long-term success. He wrote letters to former patients. He visited them. He photographed them and added the photographs to his records. Evidence, he believed, that they were living productive lives, that the surgery had helped them. Whether they had consented to these visits, whether they found them welcome or intrusive, is not recorded. By the mid-1960s, Freeman was largely operating at the margins of American psychiatry. The hospitals that had once invited him for demonstrations now declined his requests.
The professional organizations that had published his results now passed over his submissions. He was not banned. He was not officially condemned. He was, in the particular cruelty of institutional abandonment, simply ignored. He performed his last operation on the 2nd of February 1967. The patient was a woman named Helen Mortensen. She was 58 years old. This was not her first lobotomy. Freeman had operated on her twice before, in 1946 and in 1956. She had returned to him again, still suffering, still searching for the relief that the previous surgeries had not provided. That detail carries its own particular weight. Here was a woman who had been operated on twice.
Who had experienced, presumably, whatever the first two procedures produced in her, whatever loss, whatever alteration of her inner landscape those interventions had caused, and she had returned for a third. Whatever drove her back to Freeman's table was not confidence that the procedure worked. It was more likely the particular desperation of someone who has run out of other options, who is suffering in ways that the people around her cannot reach, and who accepts whatever is offered, because the alternative is to go on as she is. Freeman agreed to operate. There is no recorded hesitation in his case files. No notation of concern about performing a third transorbital procedure on the same patient. He had seen similar cases before.
He had, in his own accounting, helped people in similar situations. He operated a third time. Helen Mortensen died of a cerebral hemorrhage. The bleeding in her brain that killed her was a direct consequence of the procedure. The San Francisco medical community's response was formal and immediate. The Herrick Memorial Hospital revoked Freeman's operating privileges. It was the first time in 30 years of practice that any institution had taken that step. Freeman was 72 years old. He did not stop working. He simply stopped operating. Instead, he spent his remaining years traveling, visiting the patients whose names filled his records, documenting what had become of them. He interviewed them. He photographed them.
He wrote up their cases in the language of a physician who still believed, with apparently undiminished conviction, that he had helped them. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain that belief in the face of what he had seen on that last operating table, in the face of what he had seen across 3 decades and 3,400 procedures. That dissonance was never resolved, because Freeman never permitted it to become a question. He had decided, early and permanently, what the answer was. The procedures helped people. The evidence for this was in his files. He had assembled the files himself. There is a particular kind of moral catastrophe that looks, from the inside, like dedication. Freeman worked tirelessly.
He followed up on his patients when other surgeons did not. He maintained records when others discarded them. He believed, to the end, that he was a conscientious physician. And he was, by the conventional measures of the time, a busy and productive one. The problem was not his work ethic. The problem was what his work did to the people it touched. He died on the 31st of May, 1972, of cancer. He was 77. He had never publicly recanted. He had never expressed regret. He had never, in any document that survives him, acknowledged that the 3,400 people on whom he had used his icepick might have been owed something more than the outcomes he had decided, on their behalf, to call improvements.
Howard Dully was 12 years old when Walter Freeman came to his house for dinner. It was December of 1960. Freeman sat at the table with Howard's father and his stepmother, Lou. Lou Dully had been bringing complaints about Howard to Freeman for months. The boy was difficult, she said, defiant. He daydreamed. He did not respond to discipline the way she expected. He was sullen. He was, she implied, something other than what a child should be. Freeman reviewed his notes. He had seen Howard in his office. He had found no clear psychiatric diagnosis, no evidence of psychosis, no presentation that unambiguously indicated the need for surgical intervention. Howard was, by most observable measures, a troubled 12-year-old living in a household where he was not wanted.
There is a name for that condition. It is not a surgical one. On the 17th of December, 1960, Freeman performed a transorbital lobotomy on Howard Dully. The boy was sedated with electroshock. Freeman inserted the leucotome beneath Howard's left eyelid, then beneath his right, and swept the instrument through the prefrontal cortex in the manner he had practiced on thousands of patients before. Howard was 12 years old. In his memoir, published in 2005 under the title My Lobotomy, Howard Dully described what the surgery took from him in terms that resist easy categorization. He did not become violent or incapacitated. He was not reduced to the vegetative state that some lobotomy patients experienced.
He grew up in the fragmented way that his circumstances allowed, passed between institutions, foster homes, and the margins of a society that had no particular place for him. What he described losing was something more diffuse, and in some ways more complete, a sense of self, a weight to his own experience. He wrote that after the surgery he felt, for decades, that there was something missing in him that he could not name, because the capacity to name it had been part of what was taken.
It was only in his 50s, researching his own medical records through a Freedom of Information request, that he found Freeman's notes on his case and understood, for the first time, exactly what had happened to him on that December morning in 1960. His stepmother died in 2003. His father died in 2004. Neither of them ever spoke to him about the surgery. Freeman's own notes on Howard Dully's case described the boy as having been not too happy with his home situation. Not psychotic, not dangerous, not suffering from any condition that any contemporary standard of care would approach surgically.
Freeman noted almost in passing that the boy had a stepmother who was at her wit's end. He performed the surgery 9 days later. Howard Dully's case is among the most documented because he survived long enough to document it himself. Most lobotomy patients did not leave memoirs. Their accounts exist, if at all, in case files written by the physicians who operated on them, filtered through the language and the value judgments of those physicians, shaped by what those physicians chose to observe and what they chose to omit.
In the 1970s, as the patients' rights movement gathered force in the United States, some survivors of psychiatric procedures began to organize. They sought legal recourse, public recognition, and institutional accountability for what had been done to them.
In 1977, a Japanese attorney named Hiroshi Suzuki filed a lawsuit on behalf of approximately 27,000 people who had undergone lobotomy procedures in that country. The suit challenged not just individual surgeons, but the system of consent, or its absence, that had allowed the procedures to be performed on people who had no legal standing to refuse. That same year, the National Institute of Mental Health in the United States issued a formal condemnation of the transorbital lobotomy procedure. It was 1977, 41 years after Freeman had performed the first American lobotomy in Washington, D.C., 25 years after chlorpromazine had begun to displace surgical intervention, 15 years after the procedures had largely ceased to be performed. The condemnation arrived, in other words, after the fact.
After the patients, after the icepick. After the lobotomobile had been parked for good, there remained, through all of this, the question of the Nobel Prize. Egas Moniz received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1949. The citation recognized his development of leucotomy as a therapeutic intervention for certain psychoses. The award was controversial even at the time. The American Psychiatric Association did not endorse it, and several members of the Nobel Committee expressed reservations, but it was given. Beginning in 2005, a sustained campaign developed among psychiatrists, historians of medicine, and patient advocates to have the award revoked. Petitions were submitted to the Nobel Committee. Academic papers were published documenting the harms of the procedure and the methodological failures of Moniz's original research.
Survivors and their families added their voices to the calls for at least a formal acknowledgement from the Nobel institution. The Nobel Committee declined. Their position was consistent with their historical practice. The prizes are not revoked. They reflect the knowledge and the standards of their time. The committee does not reassess past awards in light of subsequent developments in science or ethics. This position is coherent as a matter of institutional policy. It is also, as a matter of moral accounting, deeply unsatisfying. Because what it means practically is that the highest honor in science continues to bear the name of the procedure. The citation remains on the Nobel Foundation's website. The award stands.
Moniz was shot by one of his patients in 1949, the same year he received the Nobel Prize. The bullet lodged in his spine and left him partially paralyzed. He lived until 1955. He never expressed regret for the procedures he had developed. He believed, as Freeman would later believe, that the evidence supported his conclusions. The evidence was his own. The pattern that runs through this history, from Moniz's first operation in Lisbon in 1935 to Freeman's last in San Francisco in 1967, is not primarily a pattern of malice. That would be simpler to understand and simpler to condemn. The pattern is something more unsettling.
It is the pattern of people who were absolutely certain they were right, who selected the evidence that confirmed their certainty, who were enabled by institutions that preferred a procedure to a problem, and who operated on tens of thousands of human beings whose voices were not recorded, whose consent was not sought, and whose suffering, when it occurred, was documented in the language of the surgeons who had caused it. History does not revoke its prizes. It only, eventually, keeps the record.
There is a term in the history of medicine, iatrogenic harm. It means harm caused by the physician or by the treatment itself. It is a clinical word, precise and cold. It carries no judgment of intent. A surgeon can cause iatrogenic harm while genuinely believing they are healing. The harm and the belief are not mutually exclusive. The lobotomy era produced iatrogenic harm on a scale that psychiatric medicine has rarely seen before or since. The full accounting is difficult because the records are incomplete, because many patients were institutionalized and their outcomes were never formally tracked, and because the physicians who performed the procedures were also the ones who evaluated the results.
What can be said with confidence is this. Between 1936 and the early 1970s, somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 people in the United States alone underwent frontal lobotomy procedures. The global number is higher. Estimates place it above 100,000 worldwide. Of those people, a portion died on the table or shortly afterward. A portion experienced severe cognitive impairment, seizure disorders, incontinence, or complete personality dissolution.
That last category is the one that made the procedure so durable for so long, because in a system overwhelmed by patients it could not treat, manageability looked like progress. Quietness looked like health. A patient who no longer fought the orderlies, who no longer paced the ward at midnight, who sat in a chair and did not cause problems. That patient represented, from the perspective of an institution measuring outcomes by bed availability and staff workload, a successful outcome. The perspective of the patient was not part of the calculation. By the 1980s, the reassessment of lobotomy in academic psychiatry was largely complete. The procedure was classified in historical literature as a medical error, not a fraud, not a conspiracy, but a failure of the epistemic standards that medicine uses to distinguish treatment from intervention. Moniz's original research had no control group. It had no blinding. Its outcomes were assessed by the people who performed the surgery. Its follow-up periods were too short to capture the long-term deterioration that many patients experienced. It did not meet the standards that the medical community would, retrospectively, apply. The retrospective application of standards is, of course, complicated. The randomized controlled trial did not become the gold standard of medical evidence until after the lobotomy era had already crested.
To judge Freeman and Moniz entirely by standards that did not yet exist as formal requirements would be anachronistic. They were operating in the epistemic environment of their time, but this argument has limits, because the patients who objected, the ones who refused, the ones who begged not to be operated on, the ones whose families protested, were also operating in the epistemic environment of their time. They knew something was wrong. They said so. They were not listened to because their testimony did not count in the way that a physician's assessment counted. Their knowledge was not the right kind of knowledge. What psychiatry does differently now, in theory and increasingly in practice, is attempt to weight those testimonies.
The informed consent framework that governs modern psychiatric intervention requires, at minimum, that patients understand what is being proposed, what its effects are likely to be, and that they have the right to refuse. It is an imperfect system,
It fails in practice more often than its architects would prefer. But it exists as a formal obligation in a way that it did not in 1941, when a family's signature was sufficient to place Rosemary Kennedy under Freeman's leucotome without her knowledge or agreement. Deep brain stimulation, the modern neurosurgical technique most often compared to lobotomy in popular discussion, operates under a set of constraints that would be almost unrecognizable to Freeman. The indications are narrow. The patient must have exhausted other treatments.
The consent process involves multiple conversations, multiple specialists, a detailed explanation of risks, a formal evaluation of the patient's capacity to make the decision. The surgery is reversible. The device can be switched off, adjusted, or removed. The outcomes are monitored systematically by independent evaluators across extended follow-up periods. This is not a defense of deep brain stimulation, which carries its own risks and its own unresolved questions. It is an observation about the distance that separates the epistemics of 1950 from the epistemics of today. The distance is real. It was built, in part, on the wreckage of the lobotomy era, on the recognition that what happened in those decades represented a failure, not just of individual judgment, but of systemic accountability. But the underlying impulse that drove the era has not disappeared. The desire to solve mental illness by physically modifying the brain is still present in contemporary medicine. The fear of mental illness, the ancient, persistent fear of minds that behave in ways that social order cannot accommodate, is still present in the culture that funds and guides medical research. The history of lobotomy does not close those questions. It only makes their answers more expensive. The patients who passed through Freeman's procedure between 1936 and 1967 are, almost all of them, dead now. The last survivors of the transorbital era are in their 80s and 90s, if they are alive at all.
The institutional memory of what was done to them lives primarily in documents. In Freeman's own meticulous case files, which he donated to George Washington University. In the records of the hospitals that admitted those patients and discharged them, changed. In the few memoirs, like Howard Dully's, where the experience was articulate enough and the survival long enough to reach paper. The silence that the lobotomy was designed to create, the cessation of agitation, of resistance, of the troublesome expression of an interior life, that silence was imposed on those patients without their consent, and in many cases without their knowledge. It was called treatment. It was recorded as success. What it actually silenced, we will never fully know.
Because the testimony of the people most affected by it was, in most cases, exactly what the procedure was designed to remove. What remains, in the space where those voices would have been, is inference. We infer from the case files what the patients might have said, had they been asked. We infer from the outcomes, the vegetative states, the incontinence, the flat affect, the endless institutionalization, what the surgery actually produced, as opposed to what its practitioners claimed it produced. We infer from the few accounts that survived, like Dully's, what the texture of that loss felt like from the inside. The inference is never complete.
The gap between what was done and what was experienced by the person it was done to is, in the lobotomy era, almost always unbridgeable. That gap is itself a form of evidence. It tells you something about which testimonies a system chose to count. The history of medicine contains many such silences. It contains the silences of patients who were not asked, of subjects who were not informed, of bodies that were treated as problems to be solved rather than persons to be heard. The lobotomy era is not unique in this, but it is unusually legible.
The procedure was dramatic enough, and its trajectory was compressed enough into a single human lifetime that it can be traced with something close to completeness.
You can follow it from Moniz's first patient in Lisbon in 1935 to Freeman's last patient in San Francisco in 1967. You can read the case files. You can look at the photographs Freeman took of patients he considered successes. You can read Howard Dulley's account of what it felt like to be 12 years old and to lose something he could not name. And if you look carefully enough at those photographs, the ones Freeman carried as evidence, the ones that appeared in his presentations and his published papers, you notice something. The patients are looking at the camera. Some of them are smiling. They are, by Freeman's measure, better, calmer, less of a burden to the people around them.
What the photographs do not show is the interior. They cannot show it. Photography has never been able to photograph an interiority. What was lost in those operations? The particular quality of each person's suffering, yes, but also their resistance, their particularity, their sense that the world owed them something that they had not yet received. None of that appears in the image. Freeman's photographs are, in this sense, the visual equivalent of his case files. They record the surface. They record what was legible to the physician. They do not record the patient. And then you can ask the question that the era itself refused to ask. What was the illness? And what was the cure? And how certain were we, really, of the difference?
The B answer that the lobotomy era returned to that question was a confident one. Too confident. Confidence without the structures that constrain it is not science. It is enthusiasm wearing science's clothing. And enthusiasm in the hands of someone with an icepick can do enormous and permanent damage to a human mind. The Nobel Prize still stands. The case files still exist in an archive at George Washington University. 3,600 case histories in Freeman's precise, particular handwriting, organized by date, by procedure, by outcome as he defined it. The photographs are still there. Freeman's patients, posed and smiling, evidence of a success that some of them would not have recognized as their own.
Somewhere in those files are people whose names we do not know, whose families never went public, who lived out their remaining years in institutions or in quiet rooms that their families managed not to discuss. They are not memoirs. They are not lawsuits. They are entries in a physician's ledger, summarized in a language designed to demonstrate that the physician had done what he set out to do. In that language, most of them improved. In their own lives, whatever those look like from the inside, we cannot know. The silence he created in them endures, not because it was effective, but because it was irreversible. And irreversibility, in the history of medicine, is the kind of fact that does not care whether the physician meant well.
It does not care what the case files say. It does not care that the Nobel Prize still stands. Madness was easier to silence than to understand.